Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark. This week, we're talking about January 6th and how voters are thinking about the ongoing investigation into what happened that day. You probably remember where you were and what you were doing when you heard that a mob of the president's supporters was storming the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overturn the 2020 election. I, because of the pandemic, was working from home, and when I saw what was happening, I was so sure that this was finally it. The moment that the fever would break among Republicans and that it would be the last straw in supporting Donald Trump. But as we all know now, spoiler alert, that is not what happened for most elected Republicans or Trump voters. But it was for my guest today, Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois. You may know him along with Liz Cheney as one of the only two Republicans on the committee to investigate the January 6th attacks. Hello, Congressman Kinzinger. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this. And, January 6th is such an important day. And I think it'll be an important day in history, hopefully one we can learn from. So, it's good to be with you.
So some people might be like, why are you talking about January 6th? It's not the anniversary. We had that a couple of months ago. But I really wanted to talk about this because since January 6th, I've been asking every focus group how they feel about it. And I feel like it's really important for our listeners and people in general to hear how Trump voters and then also swing voters think about January 6th and how it might influence the 2022 election. But also, I'm so interested to have you here to think about, will the January 6th committee make a difference to how people view it? Because obviously it's become as polarized as everything else. And so I want to talk that through. And so we're going to listen to some of these voters. But before we do that, I just want to ask you, what's the main goal of the January 6th committee and where do things stand with the investigation right now? I saw that you guys are thinking about bringing in Ginny Thomas. There's this big story about the 7-hour gap on the White House call logs. Just tell us what's happening.
Yeah, so, first off, every day that goes by, it feels like we get some answers to some questions or we can kind of tie up a loose end. What was this person doing or that person doing? What was this person's goal, et cetera? And then a new kind of front to that opens up, a new question. So as has been reported, I can't confirm or deny too much with the Ginny Thomas stuff, with the 7-hour call log opening. So every day, basically, we get new areas we have to check in on. And the thing is, this can't go on in perpetuity. And it's kind of the art of where we're at right now, which is, at some point we have to wrap this up. At some point we have to present the American people the story. And that goes to what the goal of the committee is, in my mind at least, and I think in the committee's mind, and frankly in the resolution that was passed by Congress, is we need a historic accounting. We need to be able to know that in 5 and 10 years, the history books that are being taught in school, when they read about that period, is reflecting accurately what happened. And that, the people that were responsible, even if they aren't ultimately held responsible criminally by DOJ, but they're at least held responsibly in the public eye. And for me, I look at it and I say, regardless of if anybody is interested today in the January 6th committee, I know that the impact to history will probably have more of an impact than anything I've done in Congress. And I think that's kind of how the committee sees its role by and large.
Well, that obviously makes a ton of sense to me, but I am interested to get your take on how some of these voters feel about it. So for this episode, we talked to two different buckets of voters. We talked to Trump 2020 voters, people who are pretty MAGA. We didn't really screen for how MAGA, but 2020 voters just tend to be pretty MAGA. And then we also talked to some swing voters, people who voted for Biden in 20, but had voted for Trump in 16. So let's start by hearing from the Trump 2020 voters, because there are three main responses we get from them when we ask how they feel about January 6th. And I want to explore each one of them. So the first one was it wasn't that bad bucket. Not that big a deal. Stop calling it insurrection. The second one is it was a false flag operation, perpetrated by Antifa. And the third bucket is the whataboutism. What about Black Lives Matter? So let's start with the first one, it's not that bad.
It was very unfortunate what did happen.
I think it was unfortunate what happened on January 6th.
It's just kind of unfortunate.
When Fox started saying that the protest at the Capitol was an insurrection, I never watched them again after that. That was the last straw.
So unfortunate is the most common word that we hear. It's like, unfortunate is like when you bust your March Madness bracket in the first
Right.
round, not when a mob tries to overturn an election. But it is indicative of something I hear a lot from Trump voters, which is a real commitment to minimizing the events of that day. And this is something your colleagues do as well, where they kind of fight the language of insurrection or domestic terrorism and lean into something softer, like a protest that got out of control. What is that about?
So it's about like trying to have your cake and eat it too. Now, from a voter perspective, as I can kind of tell, so somebody that would say, yeah, it's unfortunate, but let's move on. It's kind of a way of acknowledging that it shouldn't have happened, as kind of giving a nod to the fact that it was a Trump-inspired insurrection. But now let's pivot to defending ourselves. And we defend ourselves by saying, yeah, it was unfortunate, but not a huge deal. Time to move on. And I think you see that in politicians too. And politicians are, as you well know, notorious for wanting to not tick anybody off. And so they think that by kind of, yeah, it was unfortunate, you're appeasing the crowd that thinks it was really bad, but you're also somehow satiating the crowd that doesn't think it was anything. So I think it's a lot of, on a voter perspective, they're the people that are gettable in the future, that are going to look back and say, that was terrible. I'm embarrassed to even have been part of anything near that. And on the politician side, they're the ones that'll forget they were ever on the side of Trump in 10 years.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is like the best bucket, because minimizing the events of the day is better than what we hear from a lot of Trump voters, which is that the whole thing was a false flag operation.
Yeah.
It's the "we were framed" bucket.
I think the FBI was behind it. Ray Epps, I'm sure you guys all heard that name. He was on the most wanted list for the people there, and then they just randomly took him off.
I think that there were people agitating it that weren't Trump supporters. I think BLM and some other Antifa groups and this sort of thing were in there.
There were some known Antifa people there that actually was there leading them, disguised as the Proud Boys or whatever, to frame them.
I definitely believe the Democratic Party was behind it. I think that they were just trying to give the impression and have it look like the Republicans were involved and orchestrated it. As far as why, help demolish the Republicans and make all of us look even worse, like framing us, essentially saying we did it.
I believe it was yet another way to disparage Republicans for all the deplorables, as we've heard. And they also wanted to set Trump up to be the bad guy.
FBI, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, Nancy Pelosi, the Capitol Hill Police. Where are people getting this stuff?
Man, I mean, it's on the internet. It's out there. And it's not even just like on the dark corners of the internet anymore. I mean, the Ray Epps conspiracy, which is something I've personally taken on because I know who Ray Epps is now. I know the story of Ray Epps. And he was a guy that basically ended up at the protest. And none of us have said that the 30,000 people there that didn't go into the Capitol didn't have a right to be there. Of course, they had a right to be there. I believe they were misled. And that's what the Ray Epps situation is. And he was taken because he's a retired Marine, kind of looks like a G-man a little bit. He has become the focus of this really dangerous conspiracy theory that has been put out by Ted Cruz, been put out by Marjorie Taylor Greene, by Massey in Kentucky. I can't wait, by the way, soon there's going to be more information to come out to prove that Epps is not some FBI agent. And by the way, why would the FBI even put Ray Epps on their poster to start with if he was an agent? But these are the groups of folks that get radicalized on the internet. Either they're going to crash really hard and come to this realization that they've been in a cult, basically, or they're not gettable. And this group makes me the most sad because it's not people that didn't go to school or people that have lost their jobs. You'll find the smartest college-educated person, the wealthiest business owner, the stratus of people that believe this stuff. It's their confirmation bias, right? Any conspiracy comports to what they believe, which is it couldn't have been us, it had to be them. This is the group that makes me the most sad.
Yeah, you are super right about the fact that the conspiracy theorizing knows no education level, knows no income level, that I see it across all kinds of demographics. But I did want to ask you, Trump's conspiracy theories, or maybe conspiracy theories in general, they thrive in a certain kind of chaos where the truth can be sometimes a little difficult to get your arms around. And one of the things people talk about a lot in the groups is like, well, the cops were letting people in.
Yeah.
You know, because so much of it came from just like selfie videos and like footage that people were taking that day. There was like cops that were getting totally railroaded and knocked over. But then there were other ones that were like taking selfies with the protesters.
Mhm.
And I don't know how to explain to people whether it's like the Capitol's big and not all the cops knew what was going on the other side of the Capitol. But like, what do you think was happening there with some of the cops?
Yeah, and you're right. This is why it becomes hard, because the explanation, it takes a longer video than a snippet. It takes explaining to explain things, and people in a 5 or 10 second environment, that doesn't matter. So we'll have to take each of these kind of separately. There's a video of Ray Epps on the front line, and it looks like he's whispering into some guy's ear, and then the guy charges the barricade. Well, what actually happened, if you look at the longer video, the guy was charging the barricade, and Ray Epps whispered in his ear, "We can't do this. Let's not, in essence, destroy this protest moment." But that takes a longer video. And on the police officers, you know, there's one particularly where you see officers remove a barricade. Well, that was a tactical retreat. So they were basically outnumbered on the line they were at. And that's when in essence, almost a broken arrow call goes out, where it's like, we need every officer, particularly Capitol Police, come up and defend the actual building. We're going to pull the perimeter. And so they remove the bicycle racks, so the bicycle racks cannot be turned into a weapon. So what you see in this short snippet of a video is an officer, in essence, opening a gate and removing a bicycle rack, when in reality what he was doing was removing a weapon, and they were in a tactical retreat. And then there's a couple where officers getting selfies certainly acted inappropriately. You see one officer with a MAGA cap, an African-American officer. He actually wore that so that he could go save a fellow officer in the crowd, and he was hoping that that would keep him from being attacked. And then when you had the people just basically pouring into the Capitol, at that point, as an officer, your job is to try to keep everybody calm, because you can't take on 300 people by yourself. And I think the officers had pivoted to, how do we stop this from turning violent? How do we keep everybody calm? And one other quick thing, there's a video of rioters that got inside that are looking up, and there are people that believe they were looking up to a camera, to a control room, and then that door opens. And so, you know, the Capitol Police were in on it in letting folks in. Well, the truth of that is he was actually looking up to other rioters and asking them how to open the door. And they explained to him that you have to hold it for 5 seconds because it's a fire door. So it's nuts, but the 3-second video on the internet is so hard to debunk with facts and truth. And then you throw, you know, as Donald Trump was so good at doing, 500 different explanations for something even basic, and people just tune out because there's just too much.
Yes. And another thing that provides, I think, a way out or a way for people to rationalize this is that just good old-fashioned whataboutism.
Right.
I hear this from a lot of these groups that, like, look, it was, you know, just a small group. It got out of hand, but it wasn't as bad as Black Lives Matter. And, like, nobody said anything about them. Let's listen to some of that.
I do agree that some people went overboard, but I feel like during some other protests, there was a lot more damage done to some other cities compared to January 6th.
I think the break-in was a small portion, because I knew people who went to that rally. A woman and her Navy SEAL husband were both strong Trump supporters. They were both there. They said there wasn't some sort of let's go overtake the Capitol kind of message.
The inconsistencies between organizations that do have riots, and we just had a memorial to something that, you know, happened for one day, whereas BLM riots happened for 7 months with $1 billion worth of damage. There was one day, and the people who died ended up being the rioters themselves.
So I always feel like this one, the what about the Black Lives Matter protests? Now, I, in my own head, say there's a difference between protesting the murder of George Floyd and like trying to overturn an election. I think there's a real difference there. That being said, there's a point to this idea, or like it's that sense of like we're being treated differently. We're being held accountable. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I fully agree with you. I think this is kind of almost a half-truth argument, and I think this would be a full truth if it was, instead of used as an excuse to justify January 6th or to minimize it, if it followed January 6th was a tragic day that never should have happened, period. I also would like to mention the riots over the summer. That's different than, well, I'm not too upset about it because of the riots. Now, look, I think when they mention the riots, they have a solid point. I was activated with the National Guard to go to Minneapolis. I was overhead in my airplane, and when the Guard showed up in full, it became peaceful. But there was a lot of destroyed areas, and so I think the fact that there are politicians that are making a big deal about January 6th that never said a word about the riots in the summer is part of the reason that people are just picking tribes in the Republican side and saying, I don't care what's true or not true. I'm just going to stick with my folks right now. And it's because they feel like they haven't been heard. Now, I will say also, though, that you can destroy an entire city in the United States of America and it not be a threat to democracy. What happened on January 6th, though the violence and maybe the actual economic toll was nowhere approaching the BLM riots, it really did threaten self-governance. So I think it's apples and oranges, but I do understand the point that people make sometimes in this.
Yeah, it's not hard to see how people get there, but they are different. But again, people are not seeking out the nuances of this often. So one of the other things that comes through loud and clear in the Trump groups, not at all shocking, is that Trump was definitely not responsible for the events of the day. So let's listen to what some of the MAGA voters said alongside maybe some of Trump's words from that day.
I mean, I don't think it was his fault. Like, he didn't tell people to do that.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Every month that Trump was in office, they were looking for something to attack. And I think that was just the next one up.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
He's not responsible for it.
We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing.
I don't think it was Trump's fault at all.
And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
So, he didn't say, go down to the Capitol, break down the doors, and change the votes. It's true. But I think the word incitement was probably invented for such situations as these. But what do you think? What do you think his level of culpability is for what happened that day?
I think he's fully responsible. I mean, I think had he not spread the idea that the election was stolen, which is false, had he not tweeted things like, be there January 6th, we'll be wild, this is the day we take back our country. I mean, look, you don't take back your country if you're Donald Trump and his supporters by respecting the electoral count vote. You take back your country by changing something. And there's so many other things we go through, both leading up to the election, after the election, and even after January 6th, of just like, wow, this guy, I think, knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what the battle was over, and he watched it on TV without, making calls to make it stop. And, we'll have more of that comes out with the January 6th committee. And when I hear people say he has no responsibility, bears no responsibility, and I hear it all the time among people that I at one point had considered really good friends and good supporters that have put their politics in front of their friendship. I think it goes under kind of two categories. One is just horribly misled, radicalized people that buy what they're reading on the internet. And the other is a little more of a sad kind of category, which is, it's like this idea, there's the psychologist word for it, which I'll think of it at some point, but it's basically you have had to accept something that kind of went against your values, and that is Donald Trump. And now to reject Trump, to say that he was a criminal, to turn on him, you would have to turn on yourself. You would have to turn on the fact that, your compromise for the greater good may not have been a moral compromise. And I think that's what you're seeing some of is, without realizing it, you could hook them up to a lie detector test and they'd pass it. But I think it's folks that are like, boy, if it's true that he did this, then I have to accept the role that I played in that, and I'm a good person. I wouldn't have done that. Trump wouldn't have done that. And it's just the Democrats setting this up.
I totally agree with that. But here's one of the things that bugs me the most. Donald Trump, you just kind of touched on this with it's what he said beforehand too. Like what he said just that day, they were there because of the lie that he told. And they were there because of the lie that other Republican members of Congress told them, right? Like Mo Brooks was up on that stage saying, today's the day American patriots start kicking ass. Yep. They were all there based on a lie. And one of the things that aggravates me is that these people are going to jail. And the people that told them the lie, that got them to come down there, they're like just still in Congress hanging out, just like Paul Gosar, just being Paul Gosar. And I don't even know how you could possibly answer this, but like your colleagues and Trump, like, don't they feel bad that they let these people out to dry? Like you hear that when people are testifying and in their own trials, they're saying like, thought Donald Trump wanted me to do that. What do you make of that?
It's a great question. I'd say really until 2 years ago, but even 5 years ago, up until that point, serving in the House, I always thought, even when I disagreed with the Freedom Club or whatever was going on, that everybody had a red line. There was always some basic level of decency that each member of Congress had. There was some reason to be in Congress that they would never, turn their back on. And I have lost faith in that. I don't believe that anymore. And I don't mean that to just put down our government. It's still the best government out there. But that, politicians, when it comes down to it, they are craven creatures. They don't realize it. They're doing this in self-interest. And they're as scared of losing their friend groups as they are of losing their election. And so when I see somebody like a Paul Gosar, who's basically an open white supremacist now, he's not even trying to pretend it. There was the old saying I learned in military classes, basically, that every bad guy thinks they're a good guy. So think about how they think from that end. ISIS thinks they're out really doing the right thing. Paul Gosar probably thinks he's out really doing the right thing. So I don't think he feels bad. I think, if somebody's in jail because you told a lie that got them to go to the Capitol, well, that's just, the casualties of war. That's the cause of doing business. I don't think anybody feels that. And I think you can always justify anything in your mind. And a lot of my colleagues have justified their silence by saying, well, I need to be here because I'll be replaced by somebody crazy if I don't stay silent. Or their complicity in joining the Trump thing because they can look at things like abortion or whatever and say, well, that's the greater evil. Well, when you lie to people and you're dishonest, a society, a democracy can take crazy people with responsible leaders or crazy leaders with responsible people. Right now, we have crazy leaders and crazy people.
Yeah, it's funny. We don't have audio for it because it was a hand-raised question, but one of the questions we asked this group, but we ask it all the time, is raise your hand if you think Mike Pence did the right thing that day. Nobody ever raises their hand.
Right.
Never.
Right.
Poor Mike Pence. He's out there thinking he's going to run for president. These people think he is a traitor.
They do. And it goes to show that it's what we all know is the Trump lane. You got to be Icarus here. The closer you get to the sun, your wings are going to melt every time if you try to do anything right. Or you commit the ultimate sin like Mo Brooks, which is you fall in the polls and would reflect poorly on Donald Trump. I mean, Mike Pence, look, the guy did Trump's bidding. Mike Pence carried Trump through the grab him by the P word moment, through the every moral issue he had. Mike Pence kind of sheltered him through and carried him through. And even Donald Trump threw him under the bus. And it's amazing to watch. I mean, I'm not popular among Republicans. I know that surprises you.
You and me both.
But I think I would win an election against Mike Pence any day. And he's been way more faithful to Donald Trump, but he committed the ultimate sin, which is, turned on Trump the day he needed him the most.
Dude, that's such a funny matchup. You are, but I 100% agree with you. You would outperform him because the problem for Mike Pence is that he carried all the water. So the normal Republicans are like, no, Mike Pence, you didn't stand up when it mattered. But then all the Trumpers are like, you're a traitor and you let us down. You would at least...
At the moment of need.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. You'd at least get some of the normies that are still out there who are like, geez, this guy.
I'm the rhino they know, at least.
Yeah, that's right. The MAGA people, I mean, they're just unbelievably consistent in how they think about January 6th. They diminish it, they pivot to the what about, or they say that they didn't really do it. It was somebody else. But then there's the other category of people that we talk to all the time, which are these swing voters. As the drama ramps up, I'm interested in how this particular group reacts. But I gotta say, going into these clips, one of the things that strikes me is people aren't super aware about the January 6th committee. I mean, the number one observation I have about doing the focus groups is just the extent to which you and I think about politics and other people in Washington think about politics. And then the average American, like there's just a chasm of difference in how aware people are of kind of the ongoing machinations in Washington.
Yes.
But this group is really important because they switched their votes and they felt like January 6th justified it. Let's listen just to how these flippers, as we call them, how they felt about Trump's role in the day.
I think some of it had to do with Trump inciting the extremists. And I think that his language, the words he used, his rhetoric was encouraging to those people who were on the far right to go and do what they did.
One of the reasons I didn't vote for Trump in 2020 is because he throws fuel on the fire and is very insightful and instigating in his language and responses. And I think all of that was just a perfect storm of people were already hyped. There's a lot of emotions running real high. You get a crowd of people together and you get, even if it wasn't just Trump, people that are like-minded, egging people on, and crazy stuff happens. But I would say that it was Trump's lack of action that would ultimately be responsible, because he could have stepped up and said, hey, no, guys, this isn't okay. And he didn't. He basically gave him the go-ahead to be violent and attack the Capitol.
Yeah, Trump, I don't know if he was an organizer of it, but definitely he added fuel to the fire and gave it his blessing, so to speak.
I'd lay the blame at Trump's feet. Beginning in early 2020, he started laying the groundwork for the election being fraudulent with no basis in reality. Everything he did was for his own, basically his own self-interest. And so his interest was staying in power, which I think was to avoid being sued once he got out of office or otherwise criminally prosecuted. And I mean, anybody who's paying attention is honest with themselves. How can you not blame him, if not the entire setup, the fact they came right from a rally that he was at to the Capitol? I mean, you're just not paying attention if you can't draw the line between those two, literally and figuratively.
So they blame Trump. And this is always a group that I think has typically good judgment often, because these are people who looked closely enough at something to change their mind on an issue. Listening to this group of people, do you feel like these are the people that you want the investigation to reach?
I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think these are the ones that give me hope, and they give me hope because they may not be the biggest group out there, but they will be the group that defends democracy. I came to a realization, when I used to kind of just think of the American people, quote unquote, as a Republican, as the Republican base. So I look and say, okay, 70% of Republicans believe the election was stolen. Well, there was a point at which I then, turned to realize, well, that means that whatever it is, 60 or 70% of Americans believe it wasn't stolen, which is, although it should be 100, the fact is that's enough people to ensure that we defend democracy. That's what this kind of group is that part of. They pay attention, obviously. They care. They understand that an attack on the Capitol is not just taken in the aggregate of damage and violence. It actually is a metaphoric attack on our democracy and a real attack on our democracy. And I think this kind of group is certainly one of the groups we want to reach with the January 6th committee, because in the 90s, I remember, not buying into, but hearing all the black helicopter theories and the guillotines for the Christians at FEMA camps and, all those crazy conspiracy theories when I was a kid. So there's always going to be that group. There's always going to be the conspiracy group, the ungettable group. Those aren't the target. The target are the people that actually, they may be in the middle. They may be like kind of former Republicans. I don't know who they are, but the ones that pay attention and actually care about the future of their democracy, they're going to be the ones that matter. And everybody, not just them, everybody's kid who's going to go to school and come home someday and say, Mom and Dad, I learned about this January 6th stuff didn't you guys support Donald Trump? And they're like, oh, Donald Trump, no, no, I never did, right? Because the next generation isn't going to buy any of this crap.
You know, you ask who these people are. It's interesting. They are almost always describe themselves as Republicans still, because they all voted for Trump the first time. I mean, the reason we affectionately refer to them as flippers is just that they were people who flipped from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. So it's not like people who voted for Hillary Clinton the first time. They voted for Trump the first time. So they are sort of constitutionally, and I mean that in terms of not the US Constitution, but their internal structure, they still think of themselves as Republicans, but they just hate Donald Trump. I set you up for this a little bit because nearly everyone in this group, when we asked, said it was time to move on from January 6th. And there wasn't that much interest or trust in the committee to the extent that they even knew about it. And so you get a sense of the heavy lift that the committee has to persuade people that its work matters. And these are even for people who hate Trump. Let's listen to some of what they had to say.
They should spend their time and effort doing something else than looking back at figuring out who's to blame for something that it's way in the past.
Is this still going? I thought it was over. Is that you're saying still going?
I don't trust it because, it's yet another committee, commission, whatever. But politicians may fall into, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican. And, you think, okay, it's bipartisan, but are they going to let their politics impact what they discover and decide?
If there is anything to it at all, it's likely we're not going to find out about it. I do definitely believe that the government covers stuff up, and depending on what the motive is. So it's just really like, what's the difference? Let's go ahead and prosecute the people if we have them. But what's going to happen if we don't? I don't feel like there's very much on the line.
And I'd like to figure it out so that it doesn't happen in the future, but I don't necessarily need to have this investigation to go punish the people in the past.
So these are the people that were like, they're reasonable and they've thought about this. And I'll tell you what, this is super consistent. I did focus groups all through the impeachment trials. Everyone's against the impeachment. It's funny. It's like a mixture of Republicans not liking to spend the money on this, of people feeling like it's a distraction, people not liking the negativity of it, like whatever it is, people thinking they're partisan witch hunts. But the thing that I'm really interested in digging in with you on, because I've been thinking about this, is you can hear from these voters that the committee isn't something they're either really following, or they don't trust it, or they think we should move on. Everybody likes to move on from things that were negative and feel bad. So how are we going to get people to care about this?
So, by the way, that section of people are the ones, none of it surprised me, but it is also, when I watched this whole group, it's the thing that stood out to me the most, which is that idea of moving on. And I think no matter what happens in life, whether it's an impeachment, whether it's something like this, that is going to be the sentiment, as you mentioned. And this is where leadership has to come into play to say, look, my job, yes, is not always to just reflect the desire of the people at the moment. Sometimes we have to take on bigger fights that we know are going to be important for the long-term narrative. And again, the January 6th committee, I think, is that. But it's also why I believe on the committee that this cannot go on forever. I think that we have to wrap this up when we get the information we want. We're not going to leave any stone unturned. Present this to the American people, take full accountability, and then we can move on. I don't think they're going to punish the Republicans in the midterms for January 6th. But I think, again, the importance is none of their kids are going to have a parent that actually admits to them that they supported what happened in 5 and 10 years. But I agree that that is a big problem. Now, how do we keep them interested? Look, I think when they are, it doesn't mean everybody's going to watch it, but I think when we do the hearings, when it's put in front of the American people, they're going to watch it, they're going to hear about it, they're going to be interested, whether they think they'd be interested or not, and it'll build into that American psyche. But no, I don't believe that, somehow when the January 6th committee's done, we put out our report, and now 99% of the American people thank us for our work and believe everything we have in that report. That's never been the case in this country, and it won't be this time.
Yeah, I mean, your point about leadership is dead on. I mean, some people are like, man, I don't know, the public really doesn't support this impeachment, or they just want us to, think we're spending too much money. And I'm like, okay, but it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Like
right,
sometimes the right thing to do just is the right thing to do.
When I ran for Congress, I made a commitment, and this is going to sound all happy, lucky stuff, but I'd just gotten back from Iraq. And I remember thinking, look, if we're going to ask young men and women to die for this country, I have to be willing to give up my career for this country, right? It's a very small price to pay. And at the time I thought, it'd be like a vote on Social Security or something. But I made the conscious decision when I voted to impeach Donald Trump. And then when I got on the January 6th committee, which I didn't want to do, by the way, I did not want to be on this committee. But when I was asked and I recognized the need, I said, it is worth it because I will not be able, despite the fact that my district's going to be mad at me or the base is going to be mad at me, I will be mad at myself if I don't take this historic moment and do the right thing. And that's what you need. I'm not sitting here bragging up my leadership skills, but I'm saying that's why we're a republic. That's why we're not a direct democracy, is because we need leaders to lead.
What are the opportunities for accountability here? Like, I know you said you're going to deliver your report, but you guys are creating big news around the things that are being found. It's creating, if not direct accountability, it is shining a light on some of the things that a light needs to be shown on. But what do you think the opportunities for accountability are at the end of your work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And first off, if you're kind of half paying attention to what's going on, this could just be seen as another of the 5 million investigations into Donald Trump, and none of them have gone anywhere. How many DA is like right on the edge of an indictment or some grand jury that was formed and nothing ever comes through. And I think this can get kind of muddled up in that. So I think our opportunities for accountability are a number of areas. First off is just in public acknowledgement and understanding of what happened. Second is we're not a criminal committee, obviously. We can still refer people to DOJ to make the decision. But if we put out there names of people who very openly tried to overthrow this election or lied to the American people, there's going to be some public accountability through that. Maybe they will never get a job in the White House again, or they'll be kicked out of the social circles as DOJ looks. And then that gets to the criminal part, which is, I think part of the reason that the Department of Justice has not moved faster in some areas, and I don't know this, we don't know this because there's certain walls we can't talk to DOJ about. I think they may be waiting for what we produce. Instead of doubling, the work effort, we actually have the ability to get, in many cases, more information than they do. And so I think they will certainly be very interested in the report we put forward. And I also heard, recently there's a couple new grand juries impaneled as they're expanding this investigation. But I think from a criminal perspective, it is fully in the Department of Justice. And I think they will 100% take a look at what we do and what we produce.
One of the things that keeps striking me about the stories that come out is like Mark Meadows is always at the center of them. Like it's always people, that guy, boy, he has a lot of text messages to respond to. He's got to respond to all of the Fox News primetime lineup guys telling him to stop. He's got to respond to the Supreme Court justice's wife telling him you got to overturn the election. This 7.5 hour gap in Trump's calls, like he was obviously talking to people and very likely he was talking to Meadows. He wrote a book, but then trying to hide behind executive privilege with you guys. How do you see his role in all this?
Well, he's going to end up being one of our best witnesses because his text that he did turn over before he magically claimed executive privilege halfway into giving us stuff is just a treasure trove of enjoyment and, finger pointing basically through it. And so, I think, look, this is what you've got to know about Mark Meadows is he'll smile at you and shake your hand while he's stabbing you in the back. And then he'll try to co-opt you to help stab somebody else in the back while you have a knife in your back. I mean, the guy is about the shiftiest politician you've ever met, and he's exactly what people hate about Washington, D.C., a man with no honor. So I think, his role is that. It was trying to please everybody, try to please the president, try to please any crazy that writes him, always on their side kind of thing. But in terms of where he is, right now, I think – given that we recently had a judge in the Eastman case say that it appears there could have been criminal activity done here, kind of out of the blue, put that in his ruling, I think that may give DOJ permission to move forward because we have filed criminal contempt against Meadows. But a lot of that, I think DOJ is waiting because of a question of truly executive privilege. The courts have been very clear that it doesn't apply here. We just referred 2 more for criminal contempt. And so, I think with Mark Meadows, he's one of the worst human beings you'll ever meet, and he could end up being one of our star witnesses.
Yeah, I sort of understand though I have such mixed feelings about prosecuting a former president because it's the kind of thing banana republics do. But on
Agreed.
the other
I
side,
agree.
they can just get away with it. What's the accountability process? Like, doesn't there have to be an accountability process? It's very complicated about what to do about Trump. And honestly, I could defend maybe either way, but Meadows seems like somebody you could get. And like these guys who just think they can't testify, like Steve Bannon, they can
Right.
it just seems like even from just a small democracy standpoint, just not letting people get away with that seems important.
It is, and this is where, I think we've done a good job on the committee of holding people accountable to that. A number of people have come in and pled the fifth, which we can then give them immunity so that they cannot plead the fifth and have to tell the truth or be held in contempt. There's all these number of things I'm learning now as a not lawyer. But people have learned how to game the system. They understand they're up against a clock that, the Republicans will likely take over at the turn of the year. But, I think it's really in the DOJ's possession now what to do on it. And I agree with you, by the way, on the what to do about former things. And I think anytime you prosecute a prior administration, you run real danger of a vicious cycle. But in this case, when Donald Trump tried to overthrow an election, whether you go after him or not, somebody, I think, has to pay.
Yeah. Well, just for fun, your name came up in a couple of these focus groups.
Yeah.
Let's hear what some people had to say about you.
Is he from Illinois? I seem to recall he was one of the few who stood up and denounced Trump after January 6th. So I remember thinking that he was a pretty decent guy.
I was just listening to Adam Kinzinger speak earlier today, and anything that comes out of this guy's mouth is just complete and utter BS. Real vendetta against Trump and American First voters. So it's just the reason why. I mean, I kind of suspected it was going to be a farce.
So, you've got some fans, you've got some detractors. How has the reception been to you as you have sort of become one of the most vocal critics of Trump? How's it feel?
Well, first off, I like that first guy better. Look, how does it feel? It's been long enough now that I've settled into it. I mean, it is a lonely position because we're social creatures. And a lot of the times being in politics, your social kind of circle is people involved in politics. And usually they're like-minded. And so to start to lose friends, right, and lose respect for people, or to have, I think about a month ago, I had a buddy that I flew with in Iraq. He was my co-pilot in the war, basically writing me saying you should have stayed as a pilot because you're a terrible politician, right? Those are the kinds of things that suck. But then going out for a walk and people coming up to you and saying they deeply respect what you're doing, that is on the other hand of things reaffirming. But look, I have had to get to a position, and it took a while, where I don't care what people think, because this isn't about me running for re-election. Even if I was running for re-election, this to me is literally, and even if I'm one of the few that believe it or say it, this is an oath-keeping moment. This is a moment of, are you going to keep that oath to the Constitution, or are you not, for momentary expediency? And, the second guy you mentioned that just kind of went off on me, that same person was talking about having gone on a website, I think Patriot.win or something, which is a completely radical internet site. And so I'm not popular among those people. And that to me is good, because that means they see a threat in me. And that threat is when you tell the truth, put up against lies and conspiracy, it's a real threat. So the more those people get stirred up, the more I know I'm close to the target.
Yeah, that guy was a real star in last week's episode around the big lie, because he was the one who was like, it was amazing. He was like, let me tell you about this stolen election. And he starts reading these stats, and the moderator said, well, where is that from? And he was like, he saw it on some website. It's like, it's like they found 1 million votes. They found the votes. They were counting the votes overnight. I'm not sure they just found them.
Yeah. It's how ivermectin took off, right? Like, yeah, the doctors can say, hey, ivermectin doesn't work. But, if your cousin on the internet says it does, it must. And there's always some dark conspiracy to hold these facts down.
Was there anything else in the focus groups that jumped out at you? I think we've covered a lot of it, but was just there anything, I'm always interested for people who don't watch thousands of these, anything that you found revelatory or interesting?
One of the things that I noticed is, particularly in the MAGA, but kind of the more generic Republicans and even some in the swing, you guys would ask hand-raising questions. How many of you think Joe Biden was legitimately elected or Donald Trump was legitimately elected? And it was always interesting to me to watch that pressure dynamic. These are, however many strangers on a Zoom, basically. But one person, you notice keeping his hand down until he noticed everybody else will raise their hand. And so then he kind of meekly puts his hand up. And you recognize the dynamic at play at your local political party, your Lincoln Day dinner, where you may not think the election was stolen, but everybody does. And so you kind of go along with it. I saw that on basically Zoom among complete strangers. And that stood out to me as the role that public pressure can play in radicalization or in accepting untruths.
Oh my God, I love that you brought up this point, because I think about this all the time, about how you have to kind of separate the data from the dynamic, because there's always a dynamic in the space. And there's often one person who quickly becomes the ringleader. They're the most MAGA, and they give everybody else cover. What's interesting is sometimes people ask, don't you get too much of an echo chamber when you put people from the same demographic, everybody voted for Trump in the same room? The problem is, if you did that flipper group with the Trump group, it would be totally unproductive because they would fight with each other.
Totally.
You need people to feel safe to sort of say what they really believe. But on the flip side, one of those groups you watch, there is a guy, he's in a yellow shirt, and that guy is out of the group. He's not as MAGA as the rest of them. He voted for Trump very reluctantly, doesn't want Trump to run again, but you could totally see the pressure on him.
I noticed that too. And I'll tell you, it is, though. I mean, yeah, you can interview each of them separately and get a kind of a true feeling, but that dynamic plays in real life. I mean, that dynamic works out there in the real world, and that's why people don't feel safe to say that the election wasn't stolen anymore, is because you'll get kicked out of your local Lincoln Day dinner.
Completely right. Adam Kinzinger, you're a patriot. I'm a huge fan, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on the show. We'll have you back.
Yeah, anytime. That was great. Thank you.
And thanks all of you for listening to another episode of The Focus Group. We'll be back next week. Don't forget, if you love the show, go give us a rating on Apple or anywhere you listen to your podcast. Tell your friends all about us. We'll see you next week.